Hey there, have you ever wondered how to harness the power of diversity in intergenerational trauma therapy? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to give you 7 strategies for working with diversity and ensuring that your practice is addressing all these areas. So, when we're managing complex family cases, we have a lot of complex areas to deal with. We have the parent's complex trauma, we have the child's developmental trauma, we have attachment disruptions, that these are all very complex areas just by themselves. But in intergenerational trauma therapy, we're working with all of those at the same time. And we want to make sure that we're embracing diversity and harnessing the power of that in order to access the resilience of previous generations. So, the intergenerational resilience method is what my intergenerational trauma program is based on. And the foundations to that are culture, community, and history. So, in everything that we do when we're working with a family, it's always surrounded by the history, and the community, because those are such impactful areas in the family's lives. But it's also very impactful to harness the resilience that's been in previous generations. So, we are going to talk about the top 7 aspects of diversity in working with intergenerational trauma. So, of course, general cultural competency, generational sensitivity, which is a key with intergenerational trauma, and intersectionality, historic and collective traumas, confronting stigma, and strategies for accessibility. So, those are the main 7 areas that we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with cultural competence. Now, this is an ethical requirement for us as therapists. We have to have our practices that are open and supportive of any kind of diversity. We may not be experts on every type of diversity, but we do have to have a mindset and a framework and a working attitude that we embrace this and we work with it. So it's important because that sensitivity and understanding is what creates safety for the clients. So if we don't have this foundation of being open to culture and to differences, they are going to feel that uh, right away. And they may feel a lack of safety in therapy. And again, if we go back to Porges, safety is the foundation of therapy. So, people from diverse backgrounds have experienced racism. They've experienced discrimination, and this can negatively affect the therapy process and may actually harm the client if we're not actively working towards incorporating cultural competence into our practice and supporting clients from that lens. So, one thing we have to be aware of is how culture impacts the expression and experience of trauma. So you may have one culture that their expression of trauma is very big, it's very vocal, it's a lot of emotional expression, which, if you're not familiar with that culture, you could say that this is a huge trauma reaction, but it's really within the norms of their culture. On the other side, you may have cultures that are more stoic, or they don't express a lot of emotion on the outside, but they are feeling it all on the inside. And you may kind of look at that clinical presentation and say, oh, this person is kind of numb or checked out. But we have to understand the culture behind each client that we're working with so that we know how it impacts the expression and the experience of trauma. So, the most important things that we can do as therapists are to educate yourself, and don't rely on the client or other therapists to do this for you. You have to actively seek out and search interventions that are supportive of cultural diversity, and educational trainings that help develop this part of yourself. It's always good if you Have open dialogue with your client about their cultural background, but it's not their job to teach us about it. We have to be open and listen to them, but we have to actively seek out that knowledge and training on our own. One of the most important aspects that you can harness when you're in therapy with diverse clients is maintaining cultural humility. So, even if you've done a lot of research, you have a lot of experience within a certain cultural group, going in and saying, "Oh, yeah, I know all about that," is probably not the most humble way to do that. And being open to listening to them and learning from them is going to signal to them that you're open to learning and you're not going to come in and try to teach them their own culture. The last thing we need to do is to really do our inner work on our own racism. So we have to learn different aspects of racism, how it kind of filters into life, and how that may come into the therapy room. So, one of the strategies or the ways that I have done this is there's a excellent book called Me and White Supremacy. I think it's by Layla Saad, Saad. And it's a great book. It's a 28-day experience of each day there's a different concept related to racism, and you apply this to your life. There's a journal now. So I led a group of this for therapists in my community where we looked at all these concepts and did like a 28-day challenge, and it was a really, really good experience, and I learned so much. So that would be a great resource if you're trying to learn more about anti-racism and trying to support more cultural diversity and competence in your practice. Now we're going to talk about generational sensitivity in therapy. In intergenerational trauma, it is extremely critical because it's generational by nature. So, one of the main goals in intergenerational trauma therapy is to heal the wounds between generations and stop the transmission of intergenerational trauma to the future generations. So, generational sensitivity is being what they call multi-partial to all generations. So, that's not taking the older person's side or the younger person's side. It's being open and multi-partial, being open to learning from them, supporting them, but also questioning and confronting them when there's something that's harmful to the family system. Um, so we want to do that so that we can advocate, support, and build connections between all generations, because that's really where the healing is in intergenerational trauma therapy. Without generational sensitivity, so when we don't look at a case with the whole family in multiple generations and we look at it just individually, there's a tendency that we could have split loyalties and we could actually kind of encourage or make those worse. So, an example of this would be if you're working with an individual that's impacted by intergenerational trauma and you notice that they need to set boundaries with their family, and you pump them up to set these boundaries, but you don't talk about how it's important to do this in a way that you can connect through these boundaries with other generations in your family, it may cause a split or a difficulty in that family if they're not kind of conscious of how these decisions and these um, the boundaries may affect other people. Not that they shouldn't set them, but they need to be aware of the impact on that because there's likely a lot of sensitivity between generations. So split loyalties are when there's relational tension between people, usually in a family. It can be with friends as well, but it encourages loyalty to one person at the expense of another person. In intergenerational trauma therapy, the main area that I see this happening in is when you have a grandparent, parent, and a child, and the grandparent is raising the grandchild, and they kind of become kind of almost pitted against the parent, that if the parent would have done this, that, or the other thing, or if the parent, it's the parent's fault. So it becomes like a triangle where there's a split with the grandparent and the grandchild against the parent, and the child will always have a loyalty to their parent, so it's going to create a lot of inner tension for that grandchild. um, and the split loyalties in families, when they're very intense, are the root of self-harm and suicide. So they're very damaging in families, and especially with intergenerational trauma, because they're likely there to begin with. So creating these generational conversations can be very impactful for building that connection and understanding across generations. And this is something that's really critical. We want younger generations to be able to understand, why is it that the older generations do certain things, and we want them to have kind of the context of that, so they can integrate and have that healing between generations. Next area is intersectionality. So this is looking at the interaction between different kind of social categorizations, such as race, gender, social class, and how these interact and overlap in a person's life, and the potential for discrimination and disadvantage. So this is really important when we're working with intergenerational trauma, because there's usually a high degree of intersectionality as well. So various factors can have a significant impact on therapy as well. So these intersections of different parts of social class, or areas for discrimination, or disadvantage. So if you think about a single mom who's low income, has a grade 9 education, there's lots of intersectionality there. And there's significant impacts. It may be harder for this parent to get to therapy. It may be harder because they don't have a babysitter. They may have more crises because of the stress of being a single parent and low income. They may have difficulties navigating the educational system for their kids because they only have a grade 9 education. So there may be extra areas that we can help support them to help take some of the stress out of that family system, and help them feel like they're building momentum and building some hope. So interestingly, the reverse is also true. We usually look at intersectionality where it's some of the social characteristics that there's discrimination against. They're usually the low income, single, from a minority group. But you can also have the reverse, where a married professional male may be impacted by intergenerational trauma. The intersectionality of those social constructs may cause significant barriers for this person to engage in therapy. They may have a significant degree of shame because the outside world doesn't see what's going on the inside because of that trauma history. So they may have some barriers due to the stigma of being in therapy, or to expressing emotion. So we have to look at intersectionality from both sides and all angles. So all of these factors have a huge impact on the therapy process, and they may be practical things about attendance, and it might be engagement and ability to tolerate emotion, and how quickly they can go in therapy, and how the intensity that they can handle. So we may need to engage with additional resources or community agencies or supports for a client. So if we're having difficulties due to lower education, or they haven't graduated, maybe helping them get with a learning center so that they can do their upgrading and get their degree. And I'm going to go into historical and collective traumas, but my bestie Online is Mohammed, and he says that when we have several intergenerational trauma therapy sessions with different clients a week. So Mohammed works in Afghanistan and works with hugely impacted populations. He says, it's better that the client's emotions have a great impact on the therapist's mind. What techniques are used by the therapist for psychological care after the sessions? This is a great question because intergenerational trauma therapy is very heavy work. Trauma therapy is very heavy work. But when you're dealing with the complexity of multiple generations and multiple generations of pain, it can be very heavy. So, some of the things are just practicing good self care, having a way to kind of release things that you've come across in therapy sessions. Some people do artwork between sessions, some people do sand trays. I play with my therapy dog. Um, so there's different things that can help you release day to day. And then I think having a solid framework and structure to work from and to know that it's effective and efficient, then you're less likely to feel like you're kind of drowning in all these difficulties because you'll have a very clear map of what's happening in the family and how to move forward. There's also a month in the intergenerational trauma therapist immersion calendar that works with self care. And this is exactly why, because it is so impactful on the therapist as well, that we really have to have those self care strategies. So I know Mohammed has the calendar. You might want to look forward. I think it's more like September, October that is on self care. So there's some strategies and questions in that month that would help you. But thank you for the question, and it's great to see you again, Mohammed. So now we're going to look at historical or collective traumas. So many groups of people have had considerable historical and collective trauma. So right now in the world, we're witnessing collective traumas that will become historical for the younger generations and the generations to come. If we're unaware of these histories, there's very negative impacts on therapy, and we can't expect ourselves to be aware of absolutely every detail of a client's history or collective traumas. But if we're working in a community that we aren't aware that there was a bus accident that hurt several children in the community and it affected a lot of the families, we may not have the same level of sensitivity, or the client may not feel as safe because we're not attuning to that part of their experience. But they may not even realize that that's an impact in their current presentation either. So it's always good to kind of look for like the historical and collective traumas either at referral if they're referred by a referral source or in some of your intake assessments. Um, so the negative impacts on therapy are that it can slow down progress because we're not addressing these and they're a big issue, or they have a big part in the current presentation, and we're not accounting for these traumas. So it may look like we're kind of insensitive to them, but it's really we didn't know about them. It can also rupture the therapy relationship if there's misinformation or ignorance towards these historical or collective traumas. I think we know when it's a big historical or collective trauma, like if we're working with refugees that have been displaced, we know those are big issues, but we may not think about an accident that happened in a community or a natural disaster that happened and had a significant impact on a number of people in that community. So how can we support people and use collective and historical traumas in their therapy? So we want to identify the current trauma responses that an individual or a family has developed in the current generation or historical trauma. So an example, Hopefully that didn't blacken on your side. My screen went completely black. So, we're talking about how these traumas support therapy. And we want to look for trauma responses in the current generation that may be trauma related behavior that are rooted in the historical or collective trauma. So, one thing that I ran into frequently working in Indigenous communities is that you would have parents that were very resistant to school professionals, teachers, principals, and staff because they're a second generational survivor of residential school. So their experience of education was very different and was full of fear and it was very different. And if we don't account for that and consider that in the overall picture, we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Excuse me. I'm getting over a cold and I thought this would be okay and hopefully it will. So we also want, when we're working with those historical and collective traumas, we want to normalize those trauma responses or trauma related behaviors, that these are normal reactions through that are kind of given through generations. They're passed down. And that's what helped them survive. So they're not bad. It's just that they're coping skills that may not be the most effective, or they may even be harmful now. And we want to really externalize that trauma response, that this isn't that you will never be educated or that you won't be able to get along with school personnel. It's not that your child won't make it through school. This is something that happened outside and it's putting pressure on you, but this is the way that we work through that and we no longer allow it to impact our lives. It's easier with a school example, not as easy with war, and that kind of stuff. So you need to do that gently, but we need to make sure that they understand that these trauma-related behaviors, they may look really out of place, but they're very normal and they're very adaptive at the time that they were developed and passed down. So one way that's really helpful if you can't get the information from your referral sources about these collective and historical traumas are to do genograms and to go back several generations and ask about any type of historical or collective traumas, and you'll see it'll all kind of light up and be somewhat clear when you see those patterns. So now we want to talk about confronting stigmas that impact clients. And there's all kinds of stigmas have that impact our clients. And it's critical that we have awareness when we're working with intergenerational trauma. If we go back to the knowledge that between ages 5 and 7, the brain is in a state where it can put patterns together. So it can identify patterns, but it can't go back and fact check and say, okay, yes, that's what this pattern means. And they're usually, because 5 to 7 year olds are very self-absorbed and self-centered, they usually have self-referential. So they'll be like, I'm a bad kid, or I'm not lovable. But they can't go back and fact check that experience. So another thing about that age is the brain waves and brain development is in a state where it's very susceptible to suggestion. So they believe things. This is where Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, they believe things because they're susceptible. They're just genuine and they take everything that we tell them. So if they have had negative experiences, we all have these negative self-beliefs that have developed during this time. So it's very normal, but children with intergenerational trauma typically have some really hefty ones, and they can really be triggered by stigmas. So these are the origin of negative self-beliefs. It's also the time when children start to encounter stigma and social differences. So if they have just entered kindergarten and they have never been kind of away from their own family or community, and they go to school in a different community that maybe has more diversity or different customs, or ideas and values, that's going to be a shocker to these kids. And that's where stigma can become very impactful at that age. And then it usually kind of goes underground. So we don't even have to think about it, but it pretty much drives the bus in our beliefs about ourselves. So we all have these, but the degree of shame added to any type of stigma can greatly reinforce that negative self belief. And in intergenerational trauma, one of the main things that we need to look for is the child's negative self beliefs because it's developing in the context of that transmission of intergenerational trauma. So now we're going to talk about accessibility, and there's all different kinds of types of accessibility. It can be physical accessibility of your office space. It can be in your systems, in your process of your practice. It can be in the types of therapy that you offer. It can be in any part of your therapy practice. So it's really important to kind of take a survey of where you have some accessibility needs and how you can meet these. So the physical accessibility to the office is basically having a wheelchair ramp and the right size doorways to get through. And to be able to enter the building. If you don't have that, you could offer video or phone sessions, or you need to know somebody that you could refer people to. Another area is accessibility by reading level, language, culture. So we want to look at our consents for therapy and see if there's a lot of technical language in them that it totally makes sense to us and we feel like we've kind of made them more understandable to a layperson, but they may not be. So we really want to look at that. If we're working with immigrants, refugees, or multilingual clients, we may need to have a translator or have materials translated. And the approach to intake and consent has to be supported by cultural sensitivity. So, one of the things that I do with intake and consent to support cultural sensitivity is I will gauge the person and ask them if they would rather have me ask a lot of questions or if they would just like to have a discussion. And I have to fit in the parts of consent that are important. Excuse me. So we have to make sure that we're not going in with a clipboard and trying to get down detailed information if the person is more from a culture that likes heart to heart communication. So that's our last one. Good thing because my voice is not holding out. So these are just the basics of harnessing the power of diversity and supporting clients in a culturally competent and ethical way, and ultimately create safety in the therapy setting. So, if you're interested in learning the basic foundations of intergenerational trauma therapy and you haven't gotten the 2024 intergenerational trauma therapy calendar, immersion calendar, go to calendar.barbarawoodsphd.com. I am so sorry. And next week, we're going to be talking about both the benefits of specialization and a few extras on diversity. And March is the month that we focus on the intergenerational resilience method. That's one of my favorite topics. So we're going to be moving into that and getting kind of deeper into the theory behind intergenerational trauma therapy. So thank you for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you next week.